I want to welcome to the show Dr. Mark Mayfield. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much.
I am excited about our conversation. I always love talking with fellow counselors. I feel like we have our own, special language, and it just feels good to be known in that way.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, get a bunch of counselors together and we can talk for hours.
It's a lot of I'm hearing you say, and I'm wondering about.
Right.
I love that. So you have a new book out, The Path to Wholeness, Managing Emotions, Finding Healing, and Becoming Our Best Selves. Sounds so good. So let's start off with talking about emotions, because you say that a lot of us don't really know how to even define what an emotion is. We know we have them, but we really struggle with the context of how to accurately define it.
Well, it's funny. Been in the field for almost 15 years, and I teach at Colorado Christian University. And as I was writing this book, I was kind of challenged with the fact of like, wait a second, do we have a definition of emotions that we all agree upon? And if so, what is it? And started looking, and there wasn't really a standardized one. And it's fascinating to me because we see a lot about language creating culture. And so if we don't have a definition of emotions, then like as counselors, like what are we doing? Just kind of like Dr. Daniel Siegel really creating a definition of the mind
Yeah.
that we could all agree upon. And so I look at emotions as our physiological response to internal and external stimuli. So it's our body's reaction, and then feelings are the meaning making that we develop based off our observations and our experiences. So essentially the language we put to those experiences. And many of us don't have a whole lot of language.
Yeah. Can you give me an example of maybe what that looks like if I'm feeling mad or sad, the difference of the emotion versus the feeling?
So emotion of mad is really where you feel it in your body, whether it be in your stomach or your chest or your shoulders, your head. And it can be a split second, that we react, but we're reacting based off of what we've seen in our childhoods and our lives of how somebody handles anger or being mad. And it by putting language to it, I'm mad because, or mad means this and this and this, or anger, we know is a secondary emotion. It's a conglomeration of depression and sadness and fear and disappointment and that kind of stuff. We then are able to slow down the process from the emotion to the feeling, and then have some time to reflect on it before we engage.
Yeah.
And many of us don't have that. We have that 1/100th of a second response time.
Yeah, there's not a lot of reflection or even awareness.
No.
How do you see as people develop the language skills that they're able to develop that awareness or develop that connection with themselves and with others?
I mean, it takes intentionality and time. We can't just snap our fingers. I mean, this as a counselor, like there's a whole bunch of layers that we have to go through. Why do we do what we do? What did we watch as a kid? What did we observe as a kid? What did we experience as a kid? What kind of things are keeping us stuck? I talk a lot about emotional reflexes, kind of what is that knee-jerk reaction to certain things. But many of us, I think research was saying that 90% of Americans can name only 5 emotions,
Mm.
mad, sad, glad, fear, and disgust, and the nuances, the depth, the beauty of the hundreds, if not thousands, of representations that are out there are not experienced.
And what happens when we don't experience it or we're not able to name it?
I mean, disease pathways, right? So
Mm.
it induces a cortisol stress response and adrenal response in our bodies. And what happens if we don't express them properly? We're going to develop a weakened immune system, and it's going to lead us down susceptibility of getting sick, whether it be just colds or flus. But in research, we've seen that in like Harvard studies and John Hopkins studies, people in the oncology ward have unforgiveness and bitterness, right? So things that are not worked out in a way that need to be worked out.
Yeah. So feeling our emotions isn't just a luxury, it's really a necessity to being healthy.
Well, it has to be. And if we don't take the time, and this is why I get so frustrated with society, both society in, just popular society, but also in the church culture, right? We just are really good at avoiding and numbing and placating. And I think there's such a richness that we're missing out on in just this idea of living. If we don't experience the difficult emotions, we're not going to have a chance to experience the ones that are not so difficult.
Mhm.
So it's a discipline to start with, but if we take the time to discipline ourselves to engage in the process, we'll open up and unlock, I believe, some beauty.
Yeah. What are some ways for us to be able to do that? Because you and I both know it's hard to feel those difficult emotions like shame, fear, disappointment. And we would rather feel the happy, the pleasurable emotions. But you're saying, if we turn off one, we turn off the other. And so how can we kind of build the muscles to engage with those deeper parts of our soul?
Well, it's got to be done in community, and so a lot of times when I have people that are stuck, it's got to be done in the safety of a spiritual director, a counselor, where somebody's has that third party experience to look in from the outside, right? Because I think a lot of times, family can be helpful, but a lot of times we're all kind of stuck in the same ways, and so we need that third party experience to engage in this. And so I talk through a lot of. I mean, the book is really practical in that I lay a foundation, but then I give questions and action items, and then really like actionable tools. Um, and really, what happens is we need to reflect on kind of where we've come from and what we've experienced, um, but then take action in going, okay, let's do this exercise. I have an emotions worksheet exercise that I've developed that helps people engage their emotions through the five senses. Switches it up a little bit. I've got work in becoming old friends with our emotions
Mm,
is something that's not typically talked about. And so becoming old friends, we think about emotions having all emotions have a beginning and end. All emotions have a duration and intensity. And when it comes to old friends, we have think about an old friend that you might have, when they're upset what that means, and they're not
mhm,
typically scary if they're an old friend when they're upset.
mm.
You know that it's going to last a certain length of time, and here's how it's going to play out. And so you're okay to sit with it because you know what to expect. But most of our emotions catch us off guard, or they come to this like pressure point, boiling point where we get completely bowled over by them. And now we're scrambling to react instead of interact. And so I think there's a different, we have to look at interacting and engaging our emotions and being proactive versus reacting. And a lot of our troubles come when we are reactive.
Yeah, I've never thought about that way as an old friend, but you're right. Because I think a lot of us just kind of experience, while we may experience, those thousand emotions, I think for the majority, myself included, I feel like I kind of stick around with the same kind of primary emotions, at least in regards to my struggles,
Right.
and so shame being one of those. And so if I kind of know, well, this is what shame looks like, and this is what it looks like for me to navigate it, I think the more we have that experience with it, I'm not going to say it gets easier, but it does get more familiar.
Well, yeah. So if you think about intensity and duration, I tell people with grief, time does not heal all wounds. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? But we say that all the time just to make people feel better. What happens is that over time, the duration shortens in that experience. The intensity is going to still be there. So when I think
Mhm.
about my grandfather passing away 10 years ago, and if I'm in a spot where I'm really reminiscing, the intensity of that grief is still there, but it's going to last 15, 20 minutes versus when he did, passed away yesterday, let's say, it's a pervasive intensity and pervasive duration, and it can become overwhelming. And so the same thing with our emotions. When we engage in our emotions in a certain way, we are going to, for a while, have duration be longer than we'd like, and the intensity to be
Mm-hmm.
more intense than we would like. But as we become familiar with those things, as we sit with that, and I always say, don't do it by yourself. Do it in community if you can. It creates the opportunity for the duration of that experience to shorten. And now we're not afraid of it. It's something that we can go, well, hello, old friend. What are you doing here? You know, my anxiety is that way. I have
Mm-hmm.
my telltale signs. It's coming back up again, and it's instead of circling the wagons and trying to freak out about it. I'm like, okay, wonder why it's here. What do I need to adjust? Go get my wet washcloth and my weighted blanket, close the blinds in my office, lie down for about 15-20 minutes and just listen to some music, and I'm good. But I wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
known that if I didn't experience the fullness of it.
Yeah, or if you didn't have the language behind the emotions, because a lot of us are told, well, just stop worrying about it.
Yeah,
Whenever it's
suck it
not
up.
just it's not just a worry, it's in your
Right.
body. It's a
Yeah,
physical expression of that emotion. So I love being able to tend to the emotional, that physical component, which is very biblical. There's
it is.
example after example, as you know, of attending to the physical need. But if we're denying both the emotion and the feeling, it really
Mhm.
creates a vast disconnection.
Well, it does. And now we're, disassociating from things that we need to be connected with. And I mean, that gets messy, as you know. And I mean, I always believe that the work doesn't return void. So when we begin to engage in this work, it's going to redeem itself. It's going to produce fruit. We're going to see things happen, but it may not be on our timetable. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday and they said, sometimes a microwave is too short. But when I was a kid, a microwave was like the best thing ever. We're in a
Mm-hmm.
generation now that wants that instant gratification. We want
Mm-hmm.
that instant fix, and it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sometimes we want the instant because we know that it's going to work. And when it comes to emotional work, therapeutic work, it's hard. I had a conversation with somebody today. Well, how many sessions is it going to be?
Yeah, right.
If only I knew that. If I would let you know. I'm not one of those people that just wants to withhold answers, but there's really no way of knowing. But I love that frame of reference of like what we do. There's a
Mhm.
point to it, and there's an honoring that God will have with us in it.
Well, I always tell my clients, just like you, I'm like, man, if I had an answer to that question, I'd be retired on the beaches of Bahamas someplace, because I'd market this whole thing, but like it's not. It's an individual relational engagement, and some of us, actually, no, I think most of us are going to be on this journey for the rest of our lives.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I believe that.
so if we get that mindset in the right spot and go, okay, this is my opportunity to become more Christ-like, right? Because our emotions are just an expression of the Trinity, you know, um, obviously marked by the fall, but still, the nuanced experiences can be good.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? How our emotions are an expression of the Trinity?
When I think about, we're created, mind, body, and spirit in the image of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? And so the representation of our emotional expression is in its purest form an expression of who the Holy Spirit is, in his care and communication and love for us. um, I think we end up having those difficult emotions because of the fall, but I think as we lean into those difficult emotions, we are able to understand more about ourselves and how God sees us and loves us by sitting through it. I mean, you see the 23rd Psalm, I always tell people, you recognize that the quiet waters and the green pastures were actually in the valley. They weren't on the mountaintop. Things don't grow on the mountaintops. Things grow in the
Mm.
valley. And so as we're walking through the valley, we need to understand that's where growth happens. And sometimes we're in the valley a lot longer than we want to be, but um, that's where we see God walking most clearly with us.
Mm-hmm. A moment ago, you mentioned association, and that you bring up an interesting point. A lot of us right now are numbing, whether it be through our phones or alcohol, food, shopping. I mean, you name it. People are
Mhm.
numbing in that way. How can we begin to understand that we maybe have some repressed emotions, repressed feelings whenever we don't even realize we're feeling these things?
Well, let's just get on, clear this out for a minute. All of us have repressed emotions. I don't care who you are. You could be, I do still. And I've written a book. Like, I mean, there's things that we just are in this constant process of learning and growing. So let's just assume and agree that all of us have it. And what are our emotional reflexes? Uh, I know that when I'm getting maybe sad or agitated or frustrated or anxious or disappointed, I don't like sitting with that. And so I'll go spend more time on my phone, or I'll go, want more sugary things, right? So it's paying attention to what our emotional reflexes are, taking a step back and going, okay, uh, what am I avoiding by doing these behaviors? And it's a process that's going to be different for everybody. But I think it's important for us to stop and without judgment or shame, take a step back and go, okay, are there any areas in my life that I need to drill in deeper and assess from a disassociation or just an avoidance, maybe is an easier way to say it, an avoidance
Yeah.
standpoint.
Bringing up avoidance, how do you feel like attachment and attachment theory impacts our ability to engage with our emotions and feelings?
Yeah, it's well, I mean, I think the building block for our relational and emotional foundations is in attachment. And so how we are nurtured really impacts how we engage both in emotional and relational conversations. And so, if we had a parent figure that was, super controlling, we're going to react in a certain way, whether that's turn inward or try to control it from an anxious standpoint. But we all know, I mean, as therapists, we know that we don't just have one attachment style. We kind of a mixture of attachment styles based on our upbringing. And typically it is an anxious avoidant type of attachment or avoidant anxious type of attachment where we're either avoiding our emotions based on not the non-nurturing stance of our parents, or we try to control it because of the unsettling outcomes maybe that we had growing up. So there was not a safe place to emote. There was not a place for us to get soothed when we were struggling, or we were told just to get over it. That's how I was raised. Don't cry, get over it. You're fine. Or go to your room until you're done, type of thing. So, and I think we develop our own mental constructs around that. Whether that's really how it was or not doesn't matter as much as what we've created in our minds about it.
Yeah. And I think that's so hard whenever we are taught to disengage with our emotions, to detach, and when there's shame there, to even have the courage to feel. I mean, that's still something. I had a conversation with my husband yesterday, and I'm like, this is really, for him, it was like no big deal that I brought something up. But for me, it was like really hard because it felt silly. Because in my mind, I know where he's coming from, but it's hard. I'm 43 years old, and it's still like sometimes you feel like triggered it back to that childlike state where you're like 5 years old, and it's hard to
Right.
even bring things up because it's scary.
Yeah, and it's I think the process of this is recognizing all those things kind of collide in this process. Um, and many of us, and this is where I wrote this book, many of us don't change until we have to. My hope for people as they read this book is they change because they get to or they want to.
Right.
But I mean, you've been a counselor for a long time too, and it's like I'd love to get people in that are proactive, but most of the time we get people that are in the reactive crisis modes. And it's, we can come back from that, but it's just going to take a little more work.
Yeah, and we're always on a growth journey, and rarely do we want to grow whenever we don't feel like we have to.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's uncomfortable, but I don't know about you. The more you learn how to be a friend to yourself, the more pleasant it is. What are some ways, Mark, for us to begin engaging with our emotions in a way where we can build that friendship?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's the intentionality of not dismissing where you're at. But I also think it's the slowing down of how busy we are. I mean, we can't really truly focus on ourselves if we're not taking the time to do so. I get caught up a lot with I love studying the Bible. I love kind of studying original languages and those kinds of things. And we have such a misunderstanding of the greatest commandment because we haven't read the original language. It's not a listicle check the box, love God, love self, love other, or love others, love self, and typically love self when we get to it. It's a cyclical. I mean, the scriptures were written in an Asian, Middle Eastern culture, and they don't think through linear, they think cyclically. So we have to have just a right understanding of love of self. And so in the passage it says the second is like it. Well, that actually means equal to. And so thinking of it from a cyclical, reciprocal nature, the piece of love God, love self, love others, if we're not focusing on the love of self in a healthy manner, we're not going to be able to love God and love others well either. And so I think it's taking a step back and just taking stock of our lives in ways that put ourselves first for a change and for a time being. And it might feel selfish, it might feel odd, but it's so necessary, especially if we want to love God and love others well. And so I think having a right understanding is important.
And something that we struggle with very, very much so, not just in our society, but I feel like in previous generations as well. So I love that, to not to be dismissive of ourselves, which that really requires a lot of mindfulness where we think about what we're thinking about, because a lot of those thoughts are very subtle and very sneaky. It's not like we often tell ourselves like, oh, just stop thinking about that. It's a subtle thought. Don't think about that. Almost like a whisper.
Right. It is. And if we're not slowing down enough to pay attention, we're going to just miss it. And it's just like hearing the voice of God in our, if we don't take the time to spend in silence or spend away from distractions, we're not going to hear it the way we need to.
And the other thing you mentioned is to love ourselves. I've often looked at like as an equal sign, like back in like algebra equations of like that's the way in my mind I've kind of conceptualized that. And I'm right with you, like to love God. And Paul adds to that saying that's a true act of freedom. When we love others as well as we love ourselves, that there's freedom there. But I think we're very confused when it comes to what it means to love ourselves well. I think that we think it's just like days off or vacations and bubble baths. And what would you say, Mark, is some tangible ways that you think about self-care and self-love? I'm curious, even from a male perspective, because I've had lots of conversations about this with the other female guests, but I'm curious from a male perspective, like what your view on it is.
Well, I mean, I think it can be something as planning a massage or planning acupuncture, chiropractic type stuff, right? But it's something as simple for me, like, okay, I'm feeling a little bit tired today, or I'm just a little bit stressed. I'm going to schedule some time to take a 15-minute nap, or I'm going to go outside and go for a walk, or, I do really well every week with my eating habits, but on Friday, I love a cheesecake. So I'm going to make sure that I get myself a piece of cheesecake that night, not being too legalistic about it. But also relationally, right? I mean, I think guys, if we're going to be really honest with ourselves, that we desire a couple deep relationships, and so guys that we can go deep with, talk about our struggles, talk about our fears, and so are we investing time in that? Are we spending time at our men's ministry at church? Are we finding ways to engage in that kind of deeper part of us? Many of us men can admit that, but then what do we do about it? Is a totally different thing, because we don't want to take the time to invest in those kinds of things. But then not being afraid. I think sometimes, at least as a husband and father, I feel like that if I ask for time to myself, I'm negating my responsibilities. I've got 3 kids and my wife, and they're my world, and I find it a privilege and an honor to be pouring into them, but I need to take a break from that too. And so I think it's just reorienting our perspectives of what self-care means. And so I'm trying to find 10-15 minutes a day of things that I enjoy. Could I be sitting inside right now? Yes, but I'm sitting outside because it's 75 degrees and it's gorgeous. And I'm getting some sunlight, and I need the vitamin D, right? That's just a form of self-care. So it's not complex. I think we don't do it because it's complex, or we think it's complex. But then also just going, okay, I'm going to do this exercise today about emotion. I'm going to lament today in my devotional time. I don't know what that is, but Dr. Mark talks about it in his book, so we're going to do it. Something new from a spiritual self-care perspective. And what does it look like to release things in a kind of somewhat disciplined, structured way? What does it look like to go, I have no idea what this emotion means, but I saw it on an emotions wheel. So I'm going to go do a word study on it and see if there's any way that I've connected with it in the past. And, those kinds of things. I look at that as all self-care.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. Can you talk a little bit about that lamenting exercise? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean it's I've got it outlined in the book of structured and it's basically modeled after David in the Psalms of taking a complaint to the Lord, raging against him, offering up praise, affirming your trust in him, letting him have it. I mean, it's just it's a step-by-step process. And I always challenge my clients when we do it is don't censor yourself and don't edit your writing, just free write as you go. And well, so I can cuss at God. Yes, like he can
Yes, please
handle
do. Yes.
anything. Just let it out. Let it
Research
out.
shows, and this was Dr. Caroline Leaf. She found, or she's the one I heard talk about this, that cussing is like the best way to actually feel your emotions. I feel like as Christians, we so censor ourselves.
No, right?
And I don't actually see it as cussing. I see it as the right word at the right time. You don't want to go
Yeah.
around speaking that way, but I'm with you. Like to truly lament and to be angry is going to involve a few choice words.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't think God can handle it, or somehow we're going to get in trouble. And it's like,
Or it's sin.
or it's sin. He wants us to engage in that rawness and that realness, and um, it's such a release when you do it.
Yeah, it's being honest. And I think it's in that honesty that we're actually able to tap in and, like you're saying, clear that emotion out. Because if you don't clear it out, we do store it in our bodies.
Yeah, body remembers everything.
Yep. Well, one other thing I want to talk about before we go, Mark, is this idea of forgiveness, and how is forgiveness a piece of the puzzle when it comes to being whole?
Unforgiveness and bitterness are going to harbor in our bodies similarly I mean, they're going to be unprocessed emotions. I think sometimes we think we're justified to hold on to those things because of being wronged. And I always tell people forgiveness is not about the other person. It's about you and your mindset and your heart and your posture. And we don't recognize that we're actually poisoning ourselves if we're holding on to unforgiveness. And so, in that chapter, I walk people through a step-by-step process of releasing that. And a big part of it is grieving. We don't grieve well. We think the stages of grief are meant for those, it's like, no, the stages of grief are written for people that are dying, not for people that have lost something or are working through unforgiveness. And so I have a process of basically entering into a valley of anger, bitterness, loneliness, and then intentionally working your way back up to loss adjustment, as we call it, where we've integrated that hurt into our story, into our lives, and we've released it. And we've allowed it to be a part of our story, but that we're not emotionally attached to it anymore. I mean, it's similar to working through, I think, somebody that's had trauma with an EMDR process, movement desensitization. Like we want to detach the memory from the emotional experiencing. And I think forgiveness is the same way. When we're harboring unforgiveness, we're actually actively living in that trauma.
Yeah, it stays with us when we get stuck in it. It's pretty hard to move forward whenever we're stuck.
And it affects everything.
Relationships, connections, our health. Well, this has been so good. Where can we find you, and where can we find the book?
Yeah, my website is drmayfield.com. Instagram and Facebook is the Dr. Mayfield. The book is out on May 9th. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Tyndale, Nav Press, any place that books are sold, I guess. So pick it up. I wrote it to be done in groups. And so if you've got a small group at your church that you want to do it with, even a therapeutic group can do it, where there's questions for reflection and action steps. I think it should be done in community, to be honest. But I also wrote it, it's short. It's 140 pages. And I did that on purpose because I wanted somebody that typically doesn't read these types of books to pick it up and go, okay, this is manageable. So,
and to finish it, right? Not just to start it, but to be able to finish it.
Yep, exactly.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me.